Alright everybody, welcome back to iBluairJgR. We're diving back into Final Fantasy XIV and we're going to have another chat. Last time we were talking about patch 5.08 and the state of support-oriented abilities in FF14, and we were playing as a lot of different jobs. This time we're playing as the Dark Knight, and we're going to talk about ability bloat. This is a very tricky thing to talk about, but it's also very fascinating, just like all of the topics that we talk about. But before we dive into the concept of ability bloat, I'm going to talk a little bit about my hotbar setup, because I think that is going to help to inform the discussion. And I've gotten a lot of questions about how my hotbar is set up and how my keybinds, more specifically, interact with that. So, I do not engage with the traditional W, A, S, and D keybinds because I use my mouse with my left hand and my right hand doesn't feel very comfortable on the W, A, S, and D side of the keyboard. So I have shifted all of my keybinds over to the number pad and its surrounding buttons. So instead of using, for example, 1, 2, 3, and 4, or if you're fancy, tilde 1, 2, and 3 as my primary combos, I use the left arrow, the up arrow, and the down arrow for my 1, 2, 3 combos across all of the jobs that I play. And if you're sitting in front of your keyboard right now, if you rest your hand on the number pad, then you'll notice that your thumb will sit pretty organically on the arrow keys, and that is the finger that I use to press those buttons. Now for movement, I'm using 2 for stepping backwards, 6 for moving to the right, 4 for moving to the left, and 8 for moving forward. And around those buttons are other keybinds. Depending on how often or how quickly I need to access those buttons, that determines where the button is. So 7 and 9 on the Dark Knight specifically, that's where I have Flood of Shadow on 7 and Edge of Shadow on 9. So we've got a single target and area attack that's used off the global cooldown. Then on the 3 button on the number pad, we have our stun. And if I hold down my augment button, which is control, I can also use my interrupt. Now, I have my augment button bound to a button on my mouse. It is control, but I'm using a Logitech mouse that allows me to customize the buttons, so I've changed things up there. And we can see more of those button augments with my left, up, down, and right buttons as well. We've got the normal combo on left, up, down, and right, and then if I hold down control, I gain access to Unleash and Stalwart Soul, my AoE damage combo. Whoa, that was a big effect. Then over on this section of the hotbar, we have more number pad buttons. We have divide, multiply, and minus. This is where I put the buffs for all of my jobs. So for the Dark Knight, we have delirium on divide. This gives me access to blood spiller, which is on the 1 button on the number pad. If I hold down control, I can use quietus, the area damage version of blood spiller. Now, because the Dark Knight has 2 offensive buffs, what I've done is I have, again, the divide button is for delirium, and then I hold down control, and I get blood weapon. So both of my offensive buttons are the same button press, but in order to access blood weapon, I have to hold down the augment key, control, and then for the normal one, I use delirium, which is just the normal button. And then the rest of the buttons up on these 3 sections are for buffs and defensive abilities. So we've got Rampart and Shadow Wall combined together into a single button press via a macro. We've got the Blackest Night, hold down control. I got Dark Mind. Now the final section of my keybinds is page up, page down, end, home, delete, and insert. These are buttons that I don't like to press a lot. So I put skills on those buttons that I don't need to use very often. The ones that we'll see on the Dark Knight are plunge. This is the gap closer. Now, page down is a pretty easy button for me to press, and that's why I've attached a gap closer to it. I don't want my gap closers to be inconvenient to reach, because if I'm fighting something and oh my gosh, somebody's aggroed an enemy, I need to switch targets and quickly jump over to them. The button is still easy to access, but the farther down the line I move, the more inconvenient the buttons are for me to press. And the more I put actions that are less, we'll say, less necessary to general gameplay. So provoke is right next to plunge, but it's slightly more inconvenient for me to press. I've got to kind of stretch and strain my hand just a little bit to get there. And then the final button that I have on this section is on the delete button, and that is Dark Missionary. This is a group buff that reduces our magic damage taken, and it's got a 90-second cooldown. It doesn't come into play all that often, so I'm okay with lifting my hand up to reach that particular button. But I would never put something like Blood Spiller on the delete button. If I were to just move Blood Spiller over here, this is an action that gets used a lot, and my hand is just in a very uncomfortable position in order to spam this ability. But as soon as I move it back into its normal spot, I'm much more comfortable, I'm much more relaxed. Now, all of these principles and the idea of putting actions onto buttons that are easy for you to reach, that is something that you can apply to the standard WASD setup as well, because you don't want buttons that you have to press a lot to be in inconvenient places. So what I've done is I have on screen a graphic that will show you what my setup looks like while it's on the number pad. So that's the setup that I'm using right now. And then you can see what my setup would look like if I was using WASD. It's very similar. A lot of the concepts are similar, but the buttons are just laid out a little bit different to work within the structure of WASD. So those are my keybinds. Those are the reasonings for them, and I like them. I've been using this kind of setup for several years now across pretty much every game that I play, whether it's a first-person shooter, an RPG, or what have you. Even in RTS games, I use a similar setup to this, but it works for me. It works really well, and if you are a left-handed gamer, let's say, I think the number pad is very well designed for use with the right hand if you like to have your mouse in your left hand. Okay, now that we're done talking about the keybinds, we're going to take the Dark Knight into a level 80 dungeon and talk a little bit about skill bloat. But before we go into the dungeon, I want to preface by saying I don't think the Dark Knight suffers that much from skill bloat, but it suffers from a problem that I think is directly connected to skill bloat. So here is the crux of the argument for me, the main core of the issue. A job in Final Fantasy feels like it has too many skills when it has skills in its arsenal or in its kit that don't feel good to use or don't feel well integrated into the kit. That's the basics of it, right? And the Dark Knight's kit is very well constructed. For the most part, every button that you need to press when you're playing as the Dark Knight is valuable to you, and we're going to see that once we get into the dungeon. There are some actions that don't feel as impactful as they should feel and that need buffs and stuff like that, but they are fundamentally valuable, so they don't feel like, oh, we could just throw this in the trash and we won't miss it at all, right? But that is something that exists on a couple of different jobs that are in Final Fantasy XIV right now. Summoner, for example, has a lot of weird things going on with it. Overall, I think the job is fine, but we run into some issues as soon as we bring out our Eggy. The Eggy Assault action 1 and 2 are cool, and they're thematic with the summoner. We're telling our pet to do a thing. We want it to use a specific action, so we press the button to command it to use that specific action. But the problem is that Eggy Assault 1 and 2 are interacting with the charge action system, and they don't really need to. So these actions each have 2 charges, and the potency of them is so low that pressing them doesn't feel very impactful. So instead of telling Ifrit to go get him and use Crimson Cyclone, where he slams into the enemy at a very, very fast and powerful way, he just hits the enemy for a little bit more than his normal auto attacks, and that doesn't feel good. So if something was done to Eggy Assault 1 and 2 to make the button feel like it has more oomph, raising the potency, removing the charges from it, just making it overall feel like a beefier hit, I think that would go a long way towards streamlining the summoner and getting rid of some of the bloat that exists in the job. But then on the flip side of things, there's another job that can be argued that it has bloat in it, and that's the samurai. But the excessive skills that exist in the samurai, they serve a very important function in the way that the job is designed. So the move Kaiten, for example, is technically speaking, it's unnecessary. What does Chitin do? It increases the potency of your next weapon skill by 50% for 10 seconds. It costs 20 Kenki and has a 1-second cooldown. The only time you're supposed to use Chitin is before you use an EI Jutsu, which means that the developers could reasonably remove Chitin from the game, increase the potency of EI Jutsus by 50%, and the job would be mostly the same. But the existence of Chitin creates the samurai's gameplay loop of having to manage the Kenki resource. Without Chitin, the Kenki resource doesn't need to be managed, because then we would only spend it on Shinten, and there would be no point in having Kenki build up to 100. You may as well just have 25 Kenki, and every time you get 25 Kenki, you use Shinten. Like, it turns into this weird thing where you basically have to redesign the entire job if you remove Chitin from the game. Sort of. But that's a really deep rabbit hole, and I kind of don't even want to get into that, because that's way too complex. But the point is, the Chitin ability can technically be removed from the game, and it can be technically considered a bloated ability, but it is so fundamentally connected to how the job is supposed to play that removing it causes significant problems. Whereas on the Summoner, removing or even significantly changing Eggy Assault does not hurt any other aspects of the kit in a dramatic way. Some things would need to be tweaked, but overall, taking Eggy Assault out or augmenting it doesn't so much hurt the job and the way it plays in the same way removing Chitin from the samurai changes things up. So with all of that said, we're gonna queue up for a dungeon with the Dark Knight, and we're gonna see that the majority of the Dark Knight's kit gets used in combat, but there are some things that feel somewhat bloated because they're not as in tune with the identity of the job as they should be. Okay, good. We got Academia and Eander, something like that. I don't really know how to pronounce anything. But in any case, let's drink a durability potion, eat some food, turn on our tank stance so we don't get everybody killed. And last thing I'm going to do is examine the healer, and they've got some pretty strong gear, so I can get a little bit reckless with my pulls, but I'm tempted to play it kind of safe just for the sake of conversation, but that's fine. So we'll start off by using Unmend to grab one guy, then we will AoE the group. I'm going to go all the way down, and as soon as I get to this group, I'm going to activate the Blackest Night, because I'm going to take a little bit of damage here. And as we move into the final bit, this is where things are going to start getting intense. So already I'm engaging with the majority of the buttons on my hotbar. They all are serving a purpose right now. I'm holding down that augment key so I gain access to my AoE attacks, which I have bound to them. Let's call out our shadow clone. I can't even remember the name of it right now. And we'll keep doing that. I'm going to use Arm's Length so I can slow the enemies as they're hitting me, get a little bit of extra damage reduction going there. And we're good. We're engaging with the majority of the buttons on my hotbar. I do realize I could have used Delirium a little bit sooner, and we're going to use it now just because I want this pull to end a little bit sooner. But Delirium is one of the actions on the Dark Knight's hotbar that feels like it is a bit of a bloated ability. And it's not because it makes the Dark Knight have too many buttons to press, but it's because it doesn't fit in with the identity of the Dark Knight well enough. The ability Delirium feels like it is a cheap copy of the warrior ability Inner Release, and that is very unfortunate. Oof, that pull got a little bit hairy towards the end as I started running out of cooldowns, but the healer did a great job of keeping me alive, and that was nice. So Delirium, it feels like a cheap knockoff of the warrior's ability Inner Release, and the reason is because it allows you to execute your blood weapon skills or your spender weapon skills without a cost associated with them, which is cool, but that identity and that ideology fits more in line with the warrior, which is a job that likes to do big, powerful hits. So every 90 seconds, the warrior gets to deal their biggest and most powerful hit 5 times in a row, and it's guaranteed to be a direct critical hit to make it even more powerful and even more ridiculous feeling. But with the Dark Knight, you're just using, it's a strong ability, but do I really need to use it 5 times in a row? And the thing that makes it interesting is that Dark Knight already has an ability that has a damage buff, more specifically, that has a unique interaction with the job's kit, and that's Blood Weapon. So in my mind, Delirium should be designed in a similar way to Blood Weapon in the sense that it should be connected more so to the MP-related abilities of the Dark Knight, as opposed to it just being, press this button 5 times, let's go. Because that feels more in line with how the Dark Knight is supposed to operate. It is a job, it is a melee fighter, it's a tank that uses MP as an offensive and defensive resource. Right there, pop the Blackest Knight to get access to some dark arts right there. Let's try and get out of the way of that. We'll use our gap closer, that's the page down button. If you remember the keybinds, then we'll pop Blood Weapon to try and get some of our MP back while we're fighting these guys. I'm a little bit low on MP right now. And I'm not spending my resources all that well because I'm trying to talk at the same time. I'm trying not to die while tanking in a level 80 dungeon. It's not as easy as it looks, but I'm trying my best out here, folks. So cut me a little bit of slack. And let's go ahead and use Delirium. So again, like this is not as engaging as using Inner Release on the Warrior, simply because the identity of the Dark Knight isn't about doing big, slow, single attacks. The Dark Knight is, for me, it's more about manipulating MP in a unique way. Essentially, what the developers need to do is they need to go in to every job and figure out what is the core identity that they're looking for. What is the essence of the job, and how can we tune everything in a way that is making that essence come to the surface without making things too thin. Because, oh my gosh, am I going to get clipped by that? Yep. Because if you look at the PvP side of the game again, they have trimmed down a lot of the skills that the different jobs have access to. But for the most part, they've kept the identity intact. We looked at the summoner in my previous video, and we saw that the summoner still has the ability to summon Bahamut, to summon the Phoenix. They have energy drain. They use energy drain to build up their Aether Flow, which is then used for the casting of Fester. But Aether Flow in the PvP summoner is also used to summon your pets. So there's a better interconnection of the skills, so the summoner in PvP doesn't feel bloated the way the summoner in PvE feels because of the way the skills are interacting with each other. So essentially, though, what I'm trying to bring to light here is the idea that there aren't too many... Oh, I'm not even using my cooldowns. There aren't too many actions in Final Fantasy XIV, but there are some jobs that have actions that don't play enough into the identity of a job, and that causes the job to feel like it's cluttered, it's messy, and there's just too much going on. But a job like the Dark Knight, you've noticed that I have engaged with every button in my arsenal, and for the most part, every button has a function, but there's a couple in there that have been sort of outliers. One that I've talked about this before, but one that I haven't mentioned today is Salted Earth. This is an ability that feels really weak and really lame to activate, that needs to be better integrated into the kit and have a functionality outside of, oh, it puts a dot on the floor and does a little bit of damage. Because what's interesting is there is a place for abilities that just do damage and nothing else, that don't really affect your rotation or your resources. There's nothing inherently wrong with having an ability that doesn't impact your resources and your rotation. That's totally fine. But You don't want to have too many of those, and if there are abilities like that that exist, then you want them to feel strong. And for Salted Earth, that ability does not feel strong. So if it's going to keep its low damage and its long cooldown, it's currently a 90-second cooldown, and its damage output is just kind of pathetic. Let's shield up for this guy. Wham bam. He still has not broken my shield, but the next auto attack is going to go ahead and do that, so we can use our Dark Arts on Edge of Shadow. Unfortunately, I didn't have the Blackest Night for the second activation of Lash, but I did have Rampart still activated, so I took reduced damage from the second attack. So, you know, if you're going to have a skill that's got a long cooldown, it's got to do a lot of damage. It's got to feel impactful in other ways, or it has to be integrated with the kit. And with that, I think I've kind of made the case. It's not an incredibly long case to make, but it is one that is interesting, and you can kind of comb through class by class to really. You can go through class by class to kind of figure out exactly what skills need to be removed and what skills need to stay, and which ones are integral to the rotation, which ones are just kind of there and not really serving a purpose. And that would be a whole nother thing. That would be a whole nother discussion worth having. That would arguably be fun as well. But for now, I think I've made my point that Final Fantasy XIV is not as bloated as some people will make it out to be. There's certainly a lot of buttons to press when you're engaging with your rotation, but most of those buttons are meaningful and they serve a purpose for you. So it's okay for there to be a lot of buttons to press. Because, you know, on the flip side of it, there are other MMOs that only allow you to use like 8 actions at a time or 10 actions at a time, and you have to pick and choose from a skill tree or a pool of actions what you're going to use for a certain fight. That kind of system would potentially be a lot of fun in Final Fantasy XIV, but that kind of system has never quite landed in this game. It was there to an extent with the role actions and the cross-class action system that they had in previous versions of the game, but they've ultimately scrapped it and said every job is going to have a fixed set of skills, and you always have to use that fixed set of skills, because the developers never seemed like they wanted to create a system that allows for intense levels of player freedom to potentially avoid situations where players just don't have the right tools for the right situation. Because, for example, in a dungeon in Final Fantasy XIV, in general, you need access to everything in your arsenal. You need area damage. You need single target damage. You need mitigation. You need self-healing. You have to have every tool in your arsenal at all times, or just things aren't going to work out right. But if you had the ability to select different abilities to bring in, so like for example with the Dark Knight, if I could choose to get rid of Dark Mind when I'm going into a dungeon and replace it with a physical damage mitigation tool, I would do that, because you've probably noticed that I have not used Dark Mind at all in this dungeon, because everything up to this point has been doing physical damage to me. So if it were possible to swap skills out before entering a dungeon, so that, you know, skills like Dark Mind can be replaced with something else, the Blackest Night could be replaced with something, or whatever, that would go a long way towards changing the way skill bloat feels in Final Fantasy XIV, because you would be in charge of bloating or unbloating your hotbar, right? So like if you were going into an extreme primal, for example, and you had the ability to select which skills you brought in, you would not in general bring AoE damage attacks, because extreme primals, generally speaking, are single target fights. You never need to engage with a large group of enemies the way I'm doing right now. But that kind of system doesn't necessarily need to exist if all of the skills in all of the different character classes are well designed, and that's a big thing to ask for, and that's a hard thing to achieve in a game, but Final Fantasy XIV is very close. You know, they just got a little ways to go. And there we go. That's going to do it for the chat for today. It's certainly a very interesting topic, and there are definitely a lot of different perspectives on it. Some people think most of the jobs in the game are in absolute shambles and they're completely unplayable, but I fall somewhere in the middle where I do think there is more work that the developers need to do to make things perfect and as streamlined as they possibly can be, but the majority of the jobs in the game feel very playable and are incredibly enjoyable to engage with. To wrap things up, I want to know what your thoughts are. Do you think there are too many skills in Final Fantasy XIV and they need to be culled down even farther and simplified even more? Or do you think the number of skills is okay, but the identity of some skills needs to be worked on? Like I was talking about with the summoner, we need to hammer in and find how to make buttons feel more impactful as opposed to trimming down the number of buttons we have to press. So with all of that said, I'm going to give a shout out to all of my patrons and say thank you very much for your patronage. You guys are awesome for providing additional support, and if anyone else would like to provide more support than they already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Final Fantasy XIV. The name of the channel is iBluairJgR. There's plenty more content coming in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.